As you might have noticed throughout this course, I have been giving you little tips and hints on how to speed up your workflows. The truth is that in the real world, speed is of an essence while working on motion graphics. Now, that doesn't mean we sacrifice quality. We need to make sure that quality is always at the forefront of everything we do, but we always need to look for more efficient ways of working. So I thought I put together a few more of these things that by now at this point in the semester should help you speed up your process overall. So the first one is what we call sequencing layers. Sometimes we find ourselves in a situation where we have a series of layers that require that we put them one after the other, stacking them up in some way or fashion, and then create some sort of transition between them or something like that. Think of a quick slideshow. So in order to do something like that, I brought in this Photoshop file that had all these layers set up, and these are all national park images that I had grouped inside of that file. So what I want to do is I want to think out a flow that allows me to create a quick slideshow for this. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at how this would be done. So the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that I create a transition between them of some kind. So let me go ahead and open up the opacity channel for all of these, the opacity property, and I'm going to set up I'm going to send my time marker to the 15 frame mark, and then I'm going to set an opacity of 100%. Then I'm going to go back to the beginning and I'm going to lower the opacity to 0. You notice that I did it for all of them because I had all of them selected. At the same time, I want to do a bit of scaling. So I want to be scaling down over 2.5 seconds. I want to be scaling down to about to 100%. So now with all of them still selected, I am going to place my time marker at 2 seconds, 15 frames, and I'm going to call the scaling value. Then I have that set up at 100% at that point. At the beginning of this, I want all of them to be at about 120%. Once again, notice that all of them get their values together because they all have been selected. So that's one effective way of actually changing a lot of properties in several layers at the same time. Make sure that they're all selected. So now I know that my images will be fading in and scaling down. Now, the next thing I want to do is I want to know how long these layers are. So I'll select one of the layers and then I'll look at the information at the info panel here. And they tell me they're about 36 seconds long. So with that in mind, what I want to do is I want to overlap them based on that value. So this is very important at this step. You need to select from the bottom up. So select the first layer at the bottom and then shift select all the way to the top. The order in which they are selected is important to how they stack up. You'll see why in just a second. So now what I want to do is I want to stack them up. To stack them up, I can right click on them and go to Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers, or I can go under the the animation dropdown, Keyframe Assistant, Sequence Layers. Same window will pop open. So when you do that, this overlap window opens up that tells you, okay, what do you want to do? So you want to tell it, I want to overlap this. Now you notice that we noticed that the length of the layers was 36 seconds. So what we want to do is we want to overlap for about, say, 34 seconds. So if we enter 3400, then we can click OK. You'll notice that they get stacked up, one over the other. And there's about a 2-second gap in between them. And you'll notice the result up at the top. When I play this back, I have a fairly good looking slideshow with very little work. You also noticed on the sequencing, let me undo this. You noticed on the sequencing layers that you had the ability to overlap and then add a transition. This happens when you have layers that are smaller than the length of the composition. What does that mean? Well, let's take a look at this. Let me go ahead and open up the opacity channel for all of these. And with all of them selected, let me go ahead and make sure that it is at the 100% mark, which is here. And then I'll turn off the values for all of the opacity channels, the opacity properties. Now you notice that I scroll down, I move downstream to the 100% mark, because if I had done it while it's at 0, watch what happens. If I do it while it's at 0, they all remain at 0, and that's not what I want. You can always increase it again if you want to, but that's why I went to the 100 mark. Okay, so now what we want to do at this point is, with all the transitions gone now, I want to reduce the length of these guys to say about 4 seconds. So I'm going to place my time marker, or I'll use my go to time utility, and I'll place it at 4 seconds. Go to time utility was Alt-Shift-J on the keyboard. That's how I called that window, the go to time window. And I enter 400, 4 seconds, 0 frames. Then I'm going to bring back up the endpoint of all the layers. That would be the Alt key and the close bracket key. So Alt, close bracket, brings upstream the endpoint of a layer. So now these layers are 4 seconds long now. What I want to do now is, with them selected from bottom to top, Shift select, right click, I'll go to the keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and I want them to overlap. How long do I want the overlap to be? Let's say I want the overlap to be 2 seconds. And I want a transition, dissolve from layer. So let's say, actually, let's do this at 1 sec. How do I want the overlap? About 1 second. Let's say I want that overlap for 1 second. I just want to test something out first. So yeah, that's what I thought, because now I'm going to have the thing stop and then the transition happen, and that's not what I want. So let me undo, right click, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and instead of 1 second, I want them to be 1:15, and I'll show you why in just a second. Dissolve from layer changes, boom, there it is. And so now you'll notice that they start overlapping at 2 seconds, because they were 4 seconds long and I said 1:15. Basically, they have 1:15 of time to overlap from 2:15 to 4. And so that saves me from this stopping at 100% full, and then staying put for a half a second. And I still don't like this. You see how the picture stops while it's zooming, and when it gets there and it stops? That's kind of clunky to me. I like things to cross dissolve as they're still moving. So actually I need to change this. Undo this, right click, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and I want them to overlap for 2 seconds. That's what I want. So I want to say 2 seconds, dissolve from layer. And now that I'm going to have at least 15 frames where the image is still scaling down and the cross dissolve starts with the next one before they actually completely stop. And that is a little better. I still see the clunkiness of the thing in the background. I don't like that. So let me undo this really quick. Press the scale, S key on the keyboard, drag a selection across all of the keyframes at the end of all the layers, and then move only those to the time marker, pressing Shift so that it snaps. And now I want to go ahead and do the keyframe assistant, sequence layers, 2 seconds, boom. And now, whoops, sorry. See, this is what happens when you select it from top to bottom. That's the scaling, and that's not what the staggering, and that's not what we want. We want them from bottom to top. Right click, keyframe assistant, sequence layers, 2 seconds, cross dissolve, and now I have the transition added through the application, through the actual utility. So that's image sequencing. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the next utility, which is replace footage. This is fairly simple. In replace footage, you'll notice that we have, in this composition, we have a ship that's going across the screen on this steampunk scene, let's call it that. And we have a ship that doesn't look like it belongs. I mean, I had nothing else to place in here because the artwork was not ready for this composition. So we placed this very cartoonish, almost woodcut ship in this scene. I need something that looks a little bit more appropriate for the scene. So to do that, I was waiting, like I said, for the artwork. And when I saw the artwork, when I got it, which was this, then I said, okay, can I replace that without changing any of the keyframes that I had already? Let's say this is a fairly simple animation. but let's say I had a lot of keyframes. I had that thing doing a lot of things. Well, a way to replace the footage is by making sure that you select the footage that you want changed in the composition, which is that boat, this layer here. Then go look for the footage that you want on your project and select it, and then press the Alt backslash Control Alt backslash keys. Control Alt backslash keys. The backslash key is the question mark key on your keyboard. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is by pressing the Alt key while you drag this file from the project onto your composition window. So you press the Alt key, keep it pressed, drag that piece of footage onto the composition, let it go, and then that replaces that, and it retains all the information that you had already applied to that particular layer. So it's one way to quickly replace. Dragging with the Alt key is what I would advise when you have more than one thing. So say, for example, you have several instances of that boat. Let me actually make a couple of them really quick. And I'm gonna move them in space. So let's call their position value. By the way, another hint. If you want to move all of the keys and obey the same motion for all of them, meaning the change that you're making for all the keyframes, make sure that you have them all selected. So click on the label for the keyframe, make sure that they're all highlighted, and make sure that your time marker is on top of one of the keyframes. When you do that and you come here and change the, in this case, the value of position, all of the keyframes will move down. So you won't have one key, you won't have to go back and update another keyframe. You'll see that I have both boats now overlapping. Let me move that one back down again a little bit more. And let's say this one, same thing. That one, actually, I'm gonna move, I don't know, down here. I don't know how that's gonna work, but let's say, there it is. Okay, so I have this thing. It's actually not showing because there's no masking for it. It's been hidden. So let's go ahead and, with this done, it's still there though. Why don't I see it? That's interesting that I don't see it. Let's see. Yeah, interesting. All right. So what I want to do, oh, I have LumaMat on that. Sorry, that's why. Okay, so it was on LumaMat. Okay, so with that done, what I want to do is I want to replace all those three things at the same time. So if I select all of them in this composition and then I go press the Alt key, keep it pressed, drag that one copy onto one of them here, all three of them get replaced at the same time, which makes my workflow a little faster. Okay, so that is the replacing footage. So either Control Alt backslash or long press Alt and drag the footage onto the composition to replace the selected layer. Splitting layers is something that we saw earlier in the semester when we did this, the second week, I believe, and that it was a fairly clear workflow, which is we split a layer in order to be able to apply different things to that layer. So in our case, we wanted the balloon to come around this way, go back into the distance and come behind the mountains. So to do that, what we did was we placed the balloon here. We created the animation for it. So let me create a position change for it. And in 1 second, I want this to go here. At that point, I also want scaling values. So I want scale at that point from 104 to 1. I'm just eyeballing this numbers here. And now that it's moved back, I want it to go back again to where it was originally. So Control C. Actually, let me make a copy of this keyframe here. Control C, Control V. Then this one, Control C. And I'm just going to move it back, Control V. So the idea is that the balloon goes behind the mountain. In order to go behind the mountain at some point where it's not touching anything, and this is part of paying attention to what you're doing in your, in your planning, that you have a space where you can do this, you can go ahead and split that layer. Now to split the layer, you can go ahead and say Edit, Split Layer, or Control-Shift-D, which is the shortcut. And once you do that, you can send the second copy behind the layer that you want it to go behind. Now, the second copy of it retains all of the keyframes that the original copy had. So literally, you just made a copy and moved the in point of it and moved the out point of the other one. That's basically what you did, or what the program did for you. So splitting layers is a fairly fast workflow. It also allows you to do things like, for example, in this case where we have a bouncing ball, and every time the ball hits the ground, it changes color. Now, to do this, I applied a change color effect to that particular shape. And so every time I come down here, when I hit the ground, I literally just turn off for the next layer, I turn off the visibility of the filter. And then when it hits again, I turn it back on for the next one. And it's the same layer, only split at those points. So splitting layers also works really well. Now, sometimes we have things where we have several things working at the same time. So this is a series of pre-compositions, and they all have been simply animated for this case, but sometimes we have very complicated animations, and we are presenting this to a client, for example. So this is just a series of robots going down street, and when they were animated this way, we thought, or whoever was working on it thought, okay, well, I'm done with the animation, everything is cool. Now the client comes and says, well, you know what? I want those robots to be right in the middle of the street, right where the little lines are. How can we move them? Well, you can go in and start moving things around, but notice that they all had different jumping motions at different times. And this is where things get complicated. If you have keyframes all over the place like so, they're all, they're not disjointed. You could do what I told you to do earlier, which is click on the label and position all that stuff and make sure that you have your time marker in one of them, and then make sure that you move everything down, and that would work just fine. But imagine doing this. This is only 4 layers. Now imagine if you had 50 layers or something like that to do something like this, then that can be complicated. One way to make sure that you avoid a problem like this is by making sure that you create a workflow in which there is a master piece of content, which in this case is the robot. So you'll notice that the robot is a pre-composition. So if I double click on the pre-composition, I have access to the robot and I can change the position of the robot. In this case, all of the layers are children of the robot, even though it doesn't say it. So here, if I look at the position values for them, I had created a piece of code that basically makes them all in order to create that motion, to create the motion that makes it the robot bounce this way. So it's almost bouncing as if it was going on the road. So now that's just a piece of code. And actually, let me open up the code so that you guys can have, but I'll probably have given it to you in class. So that's the code. And basically each layer is looking at the layer before to make sure that they follow the bouncing motion. So only one layer has been animated, and that is the wheel. And the wheel is animated in position, and then there's code on that wheel. I only created 3 keyframes, but I created a loop out animation, so that a piece of code so that it keeps on looping out throughout the existence of that layer. So that's what's going on here. Now, we came here to be able to move that wheel down. So let me move that wheel down a little bit, and then now I have to go back to, which one was it? Oh yeah, this one. And I need to make sure that I'm actually where I'm supposed to be. And I mean, the whole thing is just going crazy. So now, how can I go ahead and make that move, the move for this thing, and still have visibility into what I'm doing on the other layer, on the other window? So what I can do is I can go ahead and right click on the composition window, go to new on the flyout menu and create viewer. Now you notice that I now have 2 separate composition viewers. One of them is locked. You notice that this is locked, meaning that's not going to change, and another one that changes. I want to, in this, where the locked one is where I want to have the ability to see the this composition here, the more viewers composition. So if I click on it, you'll notice that it's not changing. So let me go ahead and do that, change this, move this up, and that both of them change to more viewers. Let me actually lock that view here. So I'm going to lock that view here, and that is not going to change. That view is not going to change. So with this one unlocked, let me select that composition window. I can go back to the robot composition, and I can start moving all of my layers. And when I do that, you'll notice that they show basically my change over here. So let's go ahead and change the position of my y-axis on my robot. And my code is it's actually getting affected by this. So let me go ahead and let's see, boom. And my robot is almost falling apart. Let's see what's going on. Oh, I see why, because I'm only moving 1 keyframe, duh. So let me go ahead and do that here. Whoops. Didn't mean to drag that, sorry. Let me place it here. So let's go ahead and go back to the robot composition so I can see it and move this down. I want to move those 3 keyframes for position for the wheel so that they are touching that particular, the time marker, because as you've noticed, when I go past this point, I don't see it anymore. So I don't have to go that far. I can only go to like 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds, and I should be able to see it here. And that's because my layers have been staggered in that composition. Let me show you. You see how they're staggered. So basically I'm moving past the end point of that composition. So that's why that is happening. I'll move the time marker to here. Make sure that the keyframes are being touched by the time marker. And then with all 3 selected, I can go ahead and move the robot down and place them wherever I need to. Now you'll notice that because they all came from the same pre-composition, they all obey. And so if this was 50 layers, this workflow would be a lot faster. So now that I have that done, let me go ahead and switch my view, move these guys back again, and go to my more viewers window and do a quick preview. And you'll notice that now the robots are on the little line, which is what I want, what my client wanted. So all in all, I was able to achieve all of those changes with just moving them from one point. Now let's go ahead, and that's again, if this works well, if you this saves you time if you have a lot of layers. If you have only 2 layers, don't do all that. You know, if you have 2 layers, just go ahead and change the position of the keyframes the way I show you by selecting all the position keyframes at the same time and making sure that your time marker is right on top of one of the keyframes. That's all. Now let's take a look at the next one, collapse transformations. So now let me go ahead and close one of these viewers. Now for this one, what I've done is, if you notice, I have created an animation of a ring, like a sound ring, basically flying out of a circle in the middle of the screen. And basically that's this composition here. You probably notice that this composition is very small. It's actually 600 by 600, okay? So when the ring that I created through, by animating the offset on the actual shape tube right here. So let's take a look and you'll see what I animated. I basically had an offset paths component added from here, offset paths. And that's just a circle, basically, with a stroke. And I animated the offset for the path. So basically, I created 2 keyframes, one at 0 and one at 100. So and then I made it loop through a loop out cycle piece of code. So basically, it keeps on looping. Even though I only have 2 keyframes, the thing keeps on repeating. Now, what's happening is that this is great. I mean, it works just fine. The problem is that when I bring that small composition into a bigger composition, then I get this cutoff because that composition space is only 600 pixels, while my other composition is 1280 by 720. So what happens when this gets cut off this way? Don't go back and redo the composition. There's no need for that. What you want to do in order to speed up your workflow is make sure that you use collapse transformations. Now, I know that collapse transformations, I showed it to you when we were talking about vector files and maintaining the quality of vector files even if you increase their size in order to continuously rasterize. That's what that switch is, the continuously rasterized switch. Now, in this case, what it does is basically something called collapse transformations, which basically says whatever the settings for this composition are, that's fine. But if you have things that go over to the pasteboard, then the camera settings on this composition take over. And I know we don't have a camera, but remember, you're looking at the world just because things exist on that visual. That means you have an active camera. You're looking at the world through a camera. Part of it, one of the things that tells you that you're actually looking at the world through a camera is if you were to make this a 3D layer and you were to press the C key on the keyboard, you could actually rotate your camera, as you can see. So it is one of those things that the camera exists. What this collapse transformations switch did for you is that it maintained the existence of the footage outside of the realm, outside of the area of the original composition, which was 600 by 600. So you can take advantage of that without having to modify the original composition. Another example of this is when you're working in 3D. So in 3D, for example, let's say I have this setup of clouds and sun. And as you can see, they're all in 3D. Some of them have been pushed back, some of them have been pushed forward, and they're moving. You'll notice that they get cut off again because this composition was done with different settings. So instead of changing those settings, when I bring that composition into another 3D composition like this one, for example, you'll notice that let's go ahead and create a camera, and let me actually turn off the transformation settings, the collapse transformation settings for the original layer. So let's take a look at how this looks. I brought it in here as sun clouds. This is the one that we were just looking at. I brought it in to this composition, and you notice that it gets cut off. You'll notice also that this is a 3D composition, okay? So now what's happening here is that you'll notice that when I turn my composition around, you'll notice that that layer doesn't do anything, okay? If I turn it into a 3D layer, watch what happens. I still see it as a 3D layer, and that's great, but they're all flat into one single layer, and they get cut off still. So let me undo that. What I want to do is I want to turn on the collapse transformations for that. And you'll notice that now I see the entirety of the layers. If I rotate them, they are respected as 3D layers in this environment, in this new layer. You'll see that they basically are spaced out in 3D space. So I maintain not only the spacing and the length, the width of the composition, but also the 3D-dimensionality that was created on the original composition. And so you can see that everything is respected in 3D. Okay? And that is basically the way that collapse transformations helps, basically maintaining the making sure that the camera that in which composition you're working retains control of the visual for that particular interaction with a composition, a pre-comp that might not have the appropriate width to fit within your new composition. So these are some of the examples of workflow, what should I call it? Workflow helpers, or things that make my workflow faster, things that are efficient workflow tips or techniques, things that I don't have to think of, that I do fairly quick while I'm working, that make my life a little easier and make sure that my overall work speed is fast and efficient, which is something that all clients love.